Hello and welcome to your Mystery Monday number 7. The intro to today's video looks a little bit different than it normally does. I've decided to put the goal and scale in the lower right and just leave it there as I read the story. We'll get to our usual different parts of the Mystery Mondays, the what we know, the three questions, the solution, and then you'll answer your question about the goal and scale at the end. But instead of using the intro portion to talk about the goal and scale, I'm just going to leave it down in the lower right. We know that we are going to cite strong and thorough textual evidence to support an analysis of what the text says explicitly, as well as make inferences that we can draw from the text, including where the text leaves matters uncertain. Your 4, 3, 2, 1 are listed there. And as always, if you are at a 2 or a 1, please tell me honesty is the best policy here because this isn't about you, uh, you know, feeling like you don't get it or having to tell me that you don't get it. It's about me and what I can do differently to help you understand because the goal is to get everyone to a 3 by the end of the year. And if you're at a 2 or a 1, that tells me that I need to do something different with the quotes that I highlight, with the questions that I ask, just those little things that allow me to help you better. And so today we have the case of the erring arsonist. You were sure right about that brass company, Ron Forrester said to his wife Jane as she came in the door and stepped carefully around the stacks of files that dotted the floor in their office. Actually, he spoke to his wife's back. She was on her hands and knees lifting the entire contents of a file cabinet drawer and turning it into yet another stack. Forrester Investigators Limited was planning to renovate. Was I good? Watch out for the coffee pot. What did you find exactly? Hand me the little vacuum there. Please, is the company as big as we thought? Jane's concentration was on the case was obviously broken by the demands of the renovations. Ron lifted the empty coffee pot off the seat of a former dining room chair and sat down gingerly. What do you want first, the vacuum or the information? Jane knelt, upright, arched her back, and sighed. You're right, she said. We better concentrate on this assignment or we'll never be able to afford the interior decorator. She studied her husband's face for a moment. Do you really think vertical slat blinds are a good idea? I think they're so cold, and we spend so much time here, so. She stopped abruptly, and then waved hesitantly at all the stacks of papers and files and books. Sorry, you can see where my head has been the last hour or two. To be honest, I haven't given a single second of everything to Everything Brass Incorporated. What did you find? She walked on her knees to Ron's chair. Shift, she said as she smiled at him. Ron moved over so the two of them could squeeze onto the little chair. He took a single sheet of paper out of his briefcase. You were right about Everything Brass Incorporated, he said. They do make all kinds of little brass stuff all right. Ornaments, house letters, small lamps. And they've got quite the custom line, too. For the horsey set, mostly harness strappings and customized fittings for carriages, stuff like that. Jane frowned slightly. Shouldn't you be using the past tense? Or do they have another manufacturing plant we don't know about? Everything Brass Incorporated had burned to the ground in a spectacular conflagration only about 3 weeks before. The Forresters had been retained by the insurers, Highland Park Fire and Accident Ltd., to look into the causes of the blaze and to evaluate the validity of the claim entered by Everything Brass. No, Ron said. As near as I can tell so far, the owners have no other property associated with the company. And you're right. Maybe I should say did instead of do. There's no way anything brass is going to come out of this site for a long time. It was one heck of a blaze. Then what have you got? Jane wanted to know. Enough to suggest we should look a little deeper into the background of Preston Wendell, Ron replied. Jane fixed her gaze at a spot on the window framing from which the vertical slat blinds might hang. Wendell, she said. That's the 2/3 owner. Indeed, Ron answered. And the designer, foreman, chief. Metallurgist, Top Gun salesman, PR man, everything. The other 1/3 is owned by his late father-in-law's estate. So what is it you've got? Jane shifted a little and gained a bit more territory on the chair. Well, that figure there. He held up the sheet of paper and pointed to a circled number. The $400,000, that's their gross income for the past 12 months. So, that's not out of line for a business like theirs. But compare that to this, Ron said. He pointed at another figure, $900,000. That is what everything brass is claiming in inventory loss in the fire. Now tell me, how does a company survive when its inventory in the plant is more than double the annual sales? As far as I'm concerned, it just doesn't make sense. Then you think there's something shady about Preston Wendell? Jane shifted her gaze now to the other end of the window frame. She was beginning to convince herself that vertical slat blinds were definitely out of the question. Ron broke her stare with a piece of paper. I'm almost positive, but the guy is so clean. He didn't try to hide, even a little bit, that the fire was his fault. He was as upfront as could be with the police, and it sure seemed like an accident. Heaven knows his own burns are bad enough. Naphtha, Jane interrupted. He was cleaning an antique set of brass ham knobs, wasn't he? For a set of tandem harness? Ron nodded. And he was dipping the hams right into the drum of naphtha, Jane went on. Ron nodded again. Right. Now, I'll grant you that that's an incredibly stupid thing to do, but it's not dishonest. Highland Park may be able to contest this claim because he broke fire regulations. I'm not sure. I don't think you're allowed to open a drum of naphtha like that. I'm not even sure it can be done. He paused. But he hasn't tried to deny what he was doing. He was perfectly straight about the sparks, too. He accidentally bangs the ham knobs together over the drum. This makes sparks. Poof go the naphtha fumes, sorry. Down goes everything Brass Incorporated, and almost takes Preston Wendell along, too. Again, it was really stupid, but hardly dishonest. Jane stood up. On the contrary, she said, if Highland Park pays the claim on the very basis of that story, we'll be out of business. By the way, the vertical slat blinds are completely wrong for this window. This time, I'm sure. So the question I will ask in just a minute is, what is the flaw in Preston Wendell's story that Jane Forrester has noticed? So before we move on to the questions and that final solution, we are at the what we know phase of today's video. Typically, I give you 3 things to know about the story that kind of help us with what the text says explicitly, right? That's one of those keys to drawing inferences. However, you are going to take control of this what we know for at least number 7 here and potentially going forward as well. So, what do we know? What are 3 things that we can know about this story? What does the text tell us explicitly? First, I'd like you to make a statement about Preston Wendell. What does the text tell us explicitly about Preston Wendell? Next, I'd like you to make a statement specifically about how the fire started. How did it happen? What do we know specifically from the story? Like, I want direct quotes here. This is not a summary. This is not a paraphrase. Give me a direct quote. And our next question is simply a yes or a no. If you need to look it up, that is okay with me. Does brass spark? Naphtha, pronounced naphtha, is a flammable oil containing various hydrocarbons obtained by the dry distillation of organic substances such as coal, shale, or petroleum. So that's another thing to know about today's story. And on to the close reading portion of today's Mystery Monday. Everything that you need to know about that final question is listed here in this section of text where it says, but he being Preston Wendell, but he hasn't tried to deny what he was doing. He was perfectly straight about the sparks, too. He accidentally bangs the ham knobs together over the drum. This makes sparks. Poof go the naphtha fumes. Down goes everything brass, and almost takes Preston Wendell along too. Again, it was really stupid, but hardly dishonest. Jane stood up. On the contrary, she said, if Highland Park doesn't if Highland Park pays the claim on the basis of that story, we'll be out of business. So your first question is this. From what we know on page 40, what caused everything brass to no longer exist? Question number 2 says, what can we infer about the business relationship between Jane and Ron Forrester? What is an inference that you can draw about their relationship? Remember that you need to look at what the text says explicitly, what is directly said to you, like direct quotes, word for word from the story, um, that you can make a logical leap about them with. So you're taking that concrete information and you're making that logical leap about their relationship. Question number 3 says there is always a cue for readers that acts as a turning point in the story. What is it here? And the question that comes at the end of the actual story itself says, what is the flaw in Preston Wendell's story that Jane Forrester has noticed? Okay, and so time for some instant feedback here on the answers that you gave. You should have for question number 1, from what we know on page 40, what caused everything brass to no longer exist? Well, the brass from the knobs sparked and the naphtha caught fire. If you had anything similar to that, you will get the points for that question and you're on the right track. What can we infer about the business relationship between Jane and Ron? Well, you could say many things here. You might say that they work well together. You might say that their business atmosphere is quite casual. But you should know that other answers are possible too. I just need to read those. And to get the points for the question, I'll just need to see that your answer sort of makes that logical leap. You're taking what you know and drawing those conclusions, making that logical leap. Question number 3 says there's always a cue for readers that acts as a turning point in the story. What is it here? Well, the cue for Jane here is what Ron told her. Is when Ron told her that the knobs made a spark. Taking a look at the solution. Despite her preoccupation with the vertical slat blinds, Jane Forrester noted the flaw in Preston Wendell's story. Brass does not spark, as we now know from the what we know section of today's lesson. So banging the hay knobs together would not have caused the naphtha fumes to ignite. Back now to our last question. Now that you've seen the solution, how was your answer different than the answer given there in the answer section of the solution? What would you change? What would you add? What would you do differently? And our last question is our scale. Where would you rate your ability to make those inferences, make that logical leap based on what the text says explicitly? Would you put yourself at a 4, a 3, a 2, or a 1? Unless you happened to know that brass does not spark and you are able to answer that right from the get-go, you cannot rate yourself a 4. But you can rate yourself a solid 3 if you feel comfortable with that. And if you're still sort of unsure about identifying some of that evidence, maybe you didn't know that brass sparks or doesn't spark, but you knew that that scenario seemed odd, that the sparking from the knobs lighting the naphtha solution on fire kind of was the problem. Rate yourself at a 2, or kind of maybe even at a 3 there. But if you didn't even know, or if you were unable to know that that was the evidence that we were looking for, you're kind of more in that 2, 1, 2 range. So that's kind of where maybe if you're identifying those pieces, where you can rate yourself. And once you do